William Shakespeare is perhaps the most accomplished playwright of our time. But why do some think he was not the true creator of his works? Conspiracy? Or simply rumors fueled by the green-eyed monster of envy? To be or not to be? Or more accurately, to have been or not to have been? That is the question we are asking today. William Shakespeare is perhaps the most accomplished playwright of our time. His work was so influential that he is credited with adding words to the language you and I speak today. But understanding the questions around Shakespeare's legitimacy requires understanding where he came from and how he started. William Shakespeare was born to Mary Arden and John Shakespeare in 1564. They had 8 children, but their first 2 daughters died in infancy, making William their eldest. John Shakespeare was a glove maker who also held important civic positions, elevating his status, which meant he was more likely to send his children to a local grammar school. The Shakespeare family lived in the English town of Stratford-upon-Avon on Henley Street. William lived with his family till he was 18 when he married Anne Hathaway, who was 26 and already pregnant with their first child. In 1593, Shakespeare published his first poem in London, Venus and Adonis. Shakespeare became a founder of a company of actors called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Shakespeare went on to write an average of 2 plays per year for nearly 20 years. The Lord Chamberlain's Men performed multiple times before Queen Elizabeth, and they would eventually evolve into the King's Men in 1603 once King James became their patron. While working with the King's Men, Shakespeare wrote some of his most famous romances, like The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, as well as his greatest tragedies such as King Lear and Macbeth. His most famous works include comedies like The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and tragedies like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and history plays like Henry V and Richard III. Phrases such as tongue-tied, hoodwinked, and in a pickle all come from his work, and those are just some of the over 300 words and phrases that we still use to this day. Shakespeare's complete works include 154 sonnets, 2 narrative poems, as well as a variety of other poems, and at least 37 plays. There's some debate over exactly how many he wrote, but the general consensus is at least 37. Shakespeare was so successful that he was able to purchase the second largest house in Stratford, and would go down as one of the most prolific and influential writers of all time. An incredible feat for one man. If it was one man. Maybe it wasn't. There are at least a few people that believe that the work was not done by the person we know as William Shakespeare, and possibly not done by one man at all. Why? Well, there is little proof of Shakespeare having composed his approximate 37 plays and 154 sonnets. But of course, to be fair, Shakespeare ruled the roost during the Renaissance, which was over 400 years ago. I mean, I don't keep receipts from yesterday. To truly understand these claims, let's take a look at some of the people making them, and who they think might have written these works. The origin of this theory is a little unclear, but allegedly, the theory was first introduced in 1785 when James Wilmot, a reverend and scholar, introduced the anti-Stratfordian theory, which surmised that the son of a glover from Stratford could not have produced the works we credit Shakespeare for. Which is a good question. How could a single person from the simple upbringing that Shakespeare had have authored so many quality works on complex political and legal matters, while I can't even understand what an NFT is? Wilmot traveled to Shakespeare's hometown, visited every house Shakespeare could have visited, searched local libraries, and tried to find records of any correspondence. He found nothing. Because Wilmot couldn't find proof of literary knowledge, no written letters or signs of even owning a book, Wilmot concluded that Shakespeare could not have been educated enough to have authored so many sophisticated works. Wilmot proposed that Francis Bacon, a philosopher, politician, and contemporary of Shakespeare's, was the true author of his works. Though the validity of his research has been questioned, and it's even been suggested that it was entirely fabricated in order to support later theories. In the 1850s, American writer Delia Bacon, no relation to Francis Bacon, and British bookseller William Henry Smith also published their reasonings. Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter, even wrote an introduction to Bacon's book. They accredited poet Walter Riley or Francis Bacon as the real writers of Romeo and Juliet. One of the more popular theories is that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was the real author, as suggested in J.T. Looney's book Shakespeare Identified, published in 1920. The Earl of Oxford traveled to many of the areas featured in Shakespeare's works. It is argued that the Earl concealed his identity because his works were so politically provocative, and he didn't want the reputation of being an ignoble playwright. And they're not alone. Famous people who are said to have questioned Shakespeare's authorship include Charlie Chaplin, Helen Keller, Sigmund Freud, Mark Twain, Henry James, Orson Welles, and Malcolm X. But then, who is the guy we know as Shakespeare? The general idea is that Shakespeare was actually a mediocre actor paid by someone of higher education and class to use his name. Some say this upper echelon person was the Earl of Oxford, perhaps Queen Elizabeth, Shakespeare's rival playwright Christopher Marlowe, or even a group of writers. Now, while I do admit that the idea of one person writing all of these incredible works seems a little far-fetched, especially when there's no records of any formal schooling or study of literature at all, there is some evidence that might debunk this theory. Firstly, it's worth pointing out that most of the grumblings that Shakespeare didn't write his own work started largely over 200 years after his death. The theory that the Earl of Oxford was the real author doesn't pass much substantial evidence considering he passed in 1604, and some of Shakespeare's greatest works, such as King Lear, The Tempest, and Macbeth, were all published after that date. So even if some were written by the Earl of Oxford, they couldn't all have been written by him. You also have to contend with the fact that there are plenty of records that point to Shakespeare being the author of his own work, including theater company records, copies of his sonnets and plays printed with his name, and commentaries by his contemporaries such as John Webster and Ben Jonson. There are also plenty of contemporary references to Shakespeare while he was a part of the Lord Chamberlain's men and the King's men. We also have Shakespeare's name actually written on his plays. A book called Wit's Commonwealth, which was published in 1598, names Shakespeare as a great contemporary English writer. It also details his work, mentioning not only his poems, but a great deal of his plays by name, such as Two Gentlemen of Verona, Love's Labour's Lost, Midsummer Night's Dream, Richard III, and Romeo and Juliet, amongst many more. This book, written by Francis Mears, curiously also notes Francis Bacon and Christopher Marlowe in the book as contemporary writers with completely separate writing careers as well. Furthermore, to believe the theories that Shakespeare was not in fact the real author would have to completely discredit the dates of his plays. Shakespeare scholar Stephen March calls the rearrangement of Shakespeare's publishing dates in order to justify the anti-Stratfordian theory the equivalent of claiming Jay-Z wrote the blueprint in 1961. Quote, "You can't write a hip-hop masterpiece before hip-hop has been invented, and you can't write A Midsummer Night's Dream until English secular comedy has come into existence." Most people claim that he wasn't the author simply because he didn't come from a family who could have afforded a higher education. But if Shakespeare did go to his local grammar school, there he would have been taught Latin, Greek, and poetry sources that he references in his work. Not to mention in The Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare references a Latin grammar book that was used in the Stratford Free School. Listen, obviously I can't know for sure who wrote what. But it seems to me that the leading reason people doubt Shakespeare is because they simply just can't fathom that one man could do all of this incredible work in a relatively short lifespan. He died when he was just 52. And I get it. I've seen videos of classical symphonies played on piano perfectly by children, and it makes me feel bad too. But maybe we shouldn't let such a cynical worldview rob us of enjoying and celebrating the incredible achievements and works of others.